Hi guys, I've been asked how I do starters, so this is my way and what I think is the way to properly do a starter. One way to help fermentation, to get a good fermentation that ferments all the way and produce nice clean beers, is to pitch enough healthy active yeast cells. And one way to do this is to do a starter. A starter takes minimum 3 days to make. I know a lot of you guys make a starter in 12 hours or 24 hours, but to do a proper starter, in my humble opinion, takes at least 3 days. It could take even more if your pitch in that starter aren't enough or aren't that healthy. So we need to plan in advance. And to break this down easy, why it takes 3 days is because yeast go through some steps. The first step is the growth phase where the yeast multiplies. Next step is fermentation, and the last step is when the yeast collects strength for another job, for the big job, and goes dormant. So we want our yeast to multiply, ferment out the starter and collect the strength to ferment our big batch. If you're pitching a starter in just 12 hours or maybe 24 hours, you're actually in that first step, and that's the growth phase, and the yeast will only multiply as much, and that actually defeats making the starter in the first place. But of course your yeast will be active, so that's a benefit. So if you're really in a rush, you could pitch it, but if your goal is to make as good beer as possible, give your starters 3-4 days so we can ferment it out, cold crash, decant and pitch the yeast. Pitch a good amount of yeast in there. For normal sized ales I do my starters 2 liters, and if it were a lager I would do 4 liters. If it's a bigger ale or a bigger lager, I would do even bigger starters. Let's make a starter. Maybe I should do a review on this scale because I really love it. I have a sanitized EMI flask here, and I recommend going for a big one. This is 5 liters. It gives you a lot of headspace. Not if you do a 4 liter starter, of course, or bigger. Then you maybe should have 2 flasks. If you have the means to boil the starter in the EMI flask, do that. And I will actually boil this outside on my gas grill. So that works for me. You could boil in another container, but these are great because you can boil in them. I'm gonna use some DME. And the ratio is 100 grams per liter of water. That's the ratio I'm using. So I'm gonna put just over 200 grams in there because I want 2 liters of starter, and I also want to harvest some yeast from here. So I'm gonna do like 2.25 liters or something like that starter. So let's add 225 grams of DME. So we're about 225 there, don't have to be exact. So I'm gonna fill this up with water to take us over the 200 milliliter mark there. That was a little bit too much. I can add some more DME to that. We're about 2.5 liters, so let's add another 25 grams of DME. So I stick to my method. Okay. I added the rest of the bag. As I said, this is no rocket science. You don't have to be exact or anything like that. I'm gonna give that a shake. rinse the outside off. As we're gonna boil in the Emire flask, we're gonna be very sanitary, but just for precaution I always sanitize it before, but that might be overkill. Let's add a pinch of yeast nutrient in there as well. Why not? And the easiest way to sanitize a magnetic stir bean like this is to boil it. You do want to use a stir plate because that keeps the yeast in suspension. If you haven't got a stir plate, you could instead do twice the starter. With my method, that's quite a big starter, but that's a way, really. Of course, like many people say, give it a swirl every now and then, but you should really double the size if you don't have a stir plate. Okay, so I'm gonna boil it now. I'm gonna do it outside and it's pitch black. I will boil it for about 10 minutes and then we'll take it in and cool it down. Okay, the yeast we will be using today is a yeast which I have used a lot, but I just ditched my yeast because it went bad. So I bought a new one, which hopefully will last me as long as the last did, or even forever. And this is the White Labs 002, and I chose this yeast for two reasons. First, because I'm brewing a Christmas ale, which I want to use that yeast in, and this is a good yeast to show when you make a starter. So this will make it a good yeast for this episode. Okay, I will put this into some sanitized solution and let it sit there. As I said, it's pitch black. No street light where I live. That's the light there is a neighbor. Some neighbors as well there. So we're boiling and it's raining, so I'm trying to boil with a foil on top. I have to keep a very close eye on this because it can boil over quite easy. We're over the hot break now, so now it's easy boiling. There's steam coming out from under the foil. A good healthy boil there, and all of the inside of the Emire flask and the inside of the foil getting steamed. So this is a very good way of sanitizing. So that's why I recommend boiling in the vessel you're going to ferment it, if possible. If you don't have that means, you have to do what you can with what you got. As always, this is home brewing. Okay, the starter are inside again. Let's cool it down. So I'm gonna start with just water, and then after this has cooled down a bit, I'm gonna change the water out and put some ice packs in there. And you should put as much water in there as possible, but at least until the flask tilts. There you have most surface area. Of course, stirring it once in a while speeds things up, but it's not a huge amount of liquid, so it goes quite fast anyway. So now it tilts. Don't want it to fall over. That means you have cold water almost all around it. Okay, so we're gonna let that sit for a bit. As I said, try to give it a swirl now and then, if you can manage, or else just let it sit. Now we have to let it sit to further cool down before we can pitch our yeast. Okay, the wort has chilled down. I'll give that a shake. You don't have to shake it actually, because it's going on the stir plate, but why not? We have a sanitized scissor and we have a sanitized pack of yeast. Last dip in star san. Okay. Squeeze every last drop of it out. To get as many cells as possible in there. Okay. Why not giving it a quick shake? Then we have to line the magnet. I think we're there. And as always, remember, this is very important. You have to build in a light in your stir plate. Let's see if we have motion in there. No, let's try to line the magnets again. See if we're more lucky this time. Yeah, there you see huge pieces of yeast floating around there, and you see that motion which is created by the stir plate. So we will say goodnight to the yeast starter for this, and we will come back and follow up on the result. Good night. 2 hours after pitch, you can see that all the big pieces have dissolved. Have a good motion there. There's some small pieces left. So this is the next morning. Can't see any activity really. Maybe some krausen forming here. Or it's just foam. Hi guys, it has been 2 days since I made the starter, and the starter is now ready for the next step, and we'll now have a look at why I chose to do this video with a high flocculant yeast. If you make starters with a yeast that is not as flocculant as this one, it won't look the same. If we compare what this starter looked yesterday with today, you may see that it has happened a lot since that first day. So it's 48 hours in. Let's have a look at it. Here you can see the huge amount of yeast that has been produced, and it has flocculated together. If you're using a high flocculant yeast for your first time, don't be afraid, it's supposed to look like this. Would it been a non-as flocculant yeast like WLP001, for example, it would have looked the same as yesterday. By showing you this one with this yeast, you will see that something really happens in that extra day. So the yeast has now gone through growth, fermentation, and it has dropped out, flocculated together. The last step now is to cold crash the starter so we can decant it and of course taste it. I might have mentioned this before, always taste your starters, and you have to plan in advance. I have let a starter sit like this in the fridge cold crashing for over a week before I used it. You could also transfer the yeast with some of the liquid after cold crashing it into a smaller jar to keep in the fridge before brewing. As this is a high flocculant yeast, you could just turn this off and it will drop out immediately. But if you're using a lower flocculating yeast, you really should cold crash it before using it, so you can get the most yeast out of it. And of course, it's also the option just to pour the whole starter into your wort. That would, in this case, give you about 2 liters extra of beer, so that's not too bad. Let me settle another issue. I heard, no names, I heard someone saying that adding a starter to a beer would bump up the OG because it's DME in here. If you're making a starter with a water to DME ratio, which I used, 100 grams of DME to every liter of water, you should end up somewhere around 1040. It's not rocket science. If your wort is under 1040, of course the starter will bump up the OG just a little if you add it all in. And if your wort has an OG over 1040, the starter will lower the OG. That's just pure physics. I almost always decant because I want as good as beer as possible. Someday when I'm able to do bigger size brews, or at least I get a second fermentation fridge, we could try an experiment with decant versus not decanted starter. In that case, maybe we should really do lager or something like that, so we would have a whole 4 liters. It won't hurt your beer adding it in, but I like to decant. Before I cold crash, I always harvest some. In this case, about 10% of the starter for next time I want to use that yeast. You could as easily harvest after cold crashing as well. This is just my normal routine. 1 sanitized jar. You can take the starter. Gonna swirl it up because I want to have the yeast in suspension. And let's close it. So here's the yeast for the next brew. I got a comment, I have to reply to that. They really liked me saying yeast. So here's the yeast. Here's the big amount of yeast for the brew. And the 10% smaller one, which we will tuck into the yeast fridge. I recommend putting your container of yeast in a bag before putting it into the fridge, because this is still alive, and this way you're keeping it clean and you're keeping it out from the rest of the environment. So it's just a good precaution. And here I have one with a 002 marking. So let's put that on there. As I said, this will go into the yeast fridge. And this one we'll let cold crash and use for our brew. And always remember to taste your starter before putting it to the beer. If it tastes fine, use it. If not, throw it away. And always have some dry yeast at home for an emergency. Or maybe you have some leftover slurry or something like that you could use instead. So this is my method for making a starter. It makes great beer, so try it out. Don't have a beer on me today, so thanks for watching, guys. Hope to